terrorism is a major concern for many people, but it's also, I think, something that tends to get bent out of proportion by the interests of the media, because it's very dramatic to put in the news that there's a terrorist action. And if we consider the number of people that are being killed by terrorists in the United States since 9/11, it's a very small number of people, actually. And if you compare that to the number of people that are being killed by guns in the United States, it's overwhelmingly many more by guns. But we also need to look at the causes of this terrorism. Why are people coming to the United States to blow themselves up for some cause? Because, and it has to do with their foreign policy. And Chalmers Johnson wrote about this in several books, and one of them was called Blowback. And it's because the United States was involved in these wars, particularly in the Mideast, and of course there was in the Southeast Asia too before that, in which we killed hundreds of thousands, even millions of people. And we were, fighting these wars in these other people's countries. We don't fight these wars in our own country. We're fighting them on the other side of the world. And these people, Osama bin Laden in particular, they didn't like it. They resented it, that there was American military bases in Saudi Arabia, his country. And when the Soviet Union was fighting in Afghanistan, the United States was shipping through Pakistan to the Mujahideen and Osama bin Laden in Afghanistan, Pakistan area to fight the Russians in Afghanistan. And we did the same thing with Saddam Hussein. When Iraq was fighting Iran, we gave support to Saddam Hussein fighting against the Iranians. And so these things blow back. Now, when Obama goes into using drones much more than George W. Bush did to kill so-called terrorists, he's also murdering a lot of civilians, more civilians than terrorists. And so this makes these people angry and makes them want to fight back. And so in my opinion, we need to stop killing people. That's one of my main points in this whole campaign. The United States needs to stop killing people because it just makes things worse. These military solutions are not solutions at all. They just create more conflict and more resentment and irritation and wars. So I would be for ending these wars with peaceful reconciliation through the United Nations peacekeeping, and I'm for removing troops, bringing them back home. Many of them could be retrained and maybe volunteer with the United Nations peacekeeping forces, because I do believe we need peace and we can't allow people to commit crimes. But we need to prosecute individuals for the crimes they commit, not whole countries. You don't go and punish a whole country because a few people blew up some buildings in New York City. Those 19 people all killed themselves in the process. I believe I've dedicated my life for the past 50 years to working for world peace, to serving God and humanity, and especially with a focus on world peace. I was a conscientious objector during the Vietnam War. I would not willing to go and fight and kill people in that country because it was absurd to me, and so I have studied this, and I have written many books about the history of civilization and a 2-volume history of peace. I've studied all the great peacemakers throughout history and efforts to bring about world peace. And there are solutions, and they do work, but not the military solutions. We can solve our problems. The world can be a stable place because all the world has basically been settled. It's not like we're going to colonize new areas. It's like the nation's borders are pretty well established. So we just need to live at peace with each other. It's not like we have Indians on the frontier anymore or anything like that. It's not that kind of a world anymore. It's a world in which we should learn to live together with one another. And we can do that by disarming first the nuclear weapons, but then also the other weapons of war. And we can replace them with democratic federal world government or international law so that the problems, the conflicts between nations would be solved in an intelligent, rational process by Like Benjamin Franklin said, why do we still keep having all these wars? We could do it with arbitration and not be killing each other. Yeah, there are many causes of war, and that tribalism is one of them, or religious conflicts is one of them, and this has been a concern in the last 20 years or so because of the conflicts in the Mideast between the Jewish religion, for example, in Israel, and the Arab countries that are primarily Muslims, and between the Christians in the United States, primarily a Christian nation, and conflicts with the Muslims. And so, you know, in my view, every major religion, and these are all major religions, has good teachings and good people in them. And most of the people in these major religions are good people. But there are these fanatics, people that they believe certain dogmas, they become more fundamentalistic, they think you have to take it literally, and they have to act on these things. And these are things that we need to learn and outgrow, in a way, how to get along with each other. It's a difficult problem, but it seems to me that if we actually apply the teachings of the real founders of these religions, of Muhammad himself, but although he did engage in some wars, he had many good teachings. But especially the Christians, we need to follow what Jesus taught. And he taught us to love our enemies and to love our neighbor as ourselves. And that's why I am appealing to Christians, because it just surprises me that so many could be voting for Republicans who are so militaristic and are in favor of these wars, and they're not in favor of helping the poor, which Jesus was obviously in favor of helping the poor. And so it's something that needs to be considered. And we need to expose the hypocrisy of the people who say they're for one thing and they don't do what they say they're for. I have studied the history of international law in my 2-volume history of peace, and it developed, especially since the time of Grotius, Huyghe de Groot, a Dutch legal philosopher, and Vattel, a Swiss, and there's been ideas from Dante on for world government or government in Europe. William Penn had a plan for peace in Europe. St. Pierre and Rousseau wrote about a plan for peace in Europe. And so there's been a lot of wars throughout history in every culture, and especially in Europe. And as technology got worse and the weapons got worse, the wars got worse, and more people were being killed in these wars. It wasn't just the knights and the warriors fighting who were getting killed. More and more wars, until we got into the 20th century, where most of the casualties in the wars are civilians. And it's just outrageous, and this is something that we have to consider and solve. And so what happened was, in the Great War, before it was called World War I, it was called the Great War, which broke out in Europe in 1914. Many millions of people were killed in that war, and the United States tried to stay out of the war. President Wilson tried to stay out of the war, but because of the German submarines attacking the shipping and so on, the United States was pulled into the war. And so Woodrow Wilson developed the idea of a League of Nations following the war, so that this war was to be the last war. That's why they called it the war to end all wars. And so the effort was to form an entity, a League of Nations, not a totalitarian world government. No one's talking about that has any sense about what we need to do. It's an institution that is designed to solve the problems of conflicts between nations, not to tell every nation what to do. And that was a plan which was not supported by the Republican Party, so that they could win the 1920 election. So the United States did not join the League of Nations. And the problem with the League of Nations was it didn't have enough power to prevent the wars. They made efforts at disarmament, but if it had been really strong, Germany never would have been allowed to rearm because Germany was defeated. But they resented what happened at the peace talks because France wanted to penalize Germans. They wanted to get territory back, and they took territory back from Germany. And so Hitler appealed to the Germans, say, we got to get back at this, we need to get our territory back. And so this led to a Second World War, which was even worse than the first one. And then you had the Allies in that war, which was France and the United States and China primarily, and Russia ended up on that side, fighting against the Axis powers, which was the fascists in Germany and Italy. And then, of course, in the East, you had the Japanese fighting against everybody else, the Chinese especially. They killed millions of Chinese. That Western Alliance called themselves the United Nations. And after the war, they set up the United Nations as another attempt at world government. But once again, it was not democratic. It only was based on, it represented governments. The governments send people to it. They were not elected. I mean, maybe they were in their own country originally, but so the United Nations was formed, and those 5 allies, which were the first five countries to get nuclear weapons, controlled the Security Council. So the United Nations, it was controlled the peacekeeping efforts, to preventing wars, the most important function. The United Nations and the League of Nations developed many functions that helped humanitarian causes throughout the world, which were helpful and good for people. But the effort to prevent wars, again, it wasn't strong enough to prevent them. And these 5 countries had the veto power on the Security Council. And so what we need is a reform of the United Nations. You see, the historical pattern is not to create an entity that's too strong, which is what everybody's afraid of. The historical pattern is to create an entity that's not strong enough to keep the peace. But we still need what we call federalism, a federal world government, and also a democratic one that's elected by the people of the world, not appointed by the governments. And when you have that, then you have a situation where you have limited powers of this, what I call the United Nations democracy. They would have the courts to resolve conflicts between countries and to protect human rights, to make sure that some dictator doesn't rise up in some country and start persecuting a minority in that country or something like that. That shouldn't be allowed. The whole world should rise up against that kind of thing, but not with the force of arms, with judicial courts of law, and these people should be put on trial, the actual individuals who are involved in doing the wrong, not having wars. And so the problems would be settled by courts and laws, and you would have a world at peace because you have a unified world. Just like in Star Trek, the Earth was already united, and they were going out into outer space because they had solved the problems on the world. So in this century, and even now, in this decade, it's the time that we need to do this. And this is what I feel my mission on this planet is to bring peace as best I can to this world.